Good morning, Year 6. We're on to Chapter 2 of Michael Morpurgo's Friend or Foe. Have a quick think about what happened in Chapter 1. Where are we at the end of Chapter 1 and what has happened? What are the big things that have happened? And who is this story about? So we've got David, who started off in the cellar of his house, and his mother woke him up, and they went off to Highbury and Islington station and met up with his class and his friend Tucky. And there they met some other teachers and went together on the underground and got to Paddington station, where lots and lots of school children from all over London were waiting for a train to go to Devon. And they waited 3 hours before the train left, and at the end of Chapter 1 they were on the train together. Can you remember who was in the train carriage with David and Tucky? So, Chapter 2. It rained all the way from London to Exeter. Miss Roberts hardly lifted her head from the books, unless it was to pull out another packet of cigarettes from her handbag. David and Tucky played noughts and crosses until they ran out of paper, and they were left staring at the window waiting for the next stop. David passed the time by tracing drops of rain as they ran in intricate and erratic patterns from the top of the window pane down towards the bottom. He would find 2 or 3 droplets that began life at the same time at the top and watch them race each other to the bottom. And sometimes they would join together and plummet down in a great flood. This passage is really, really good for figurative language, to look at the way those raindrops are described. They stopped frequently, and that did help to break the monotony of the journey. And lunch of a sandwich and a biscuit at Westbury was a chance to stretch their legs and to empty the carriage of Miss Roberts' cigarette smoke. But lunch was Tucky's downfall. He began to go white almost as soon as the train pulled out of Westbury, and a few minutes later was sick as a dog. Miss Roberts did her best, but there were no corridors on the train, so all she could do was to hold his head while the rest of them tried to keep as far away as possible. It was all cleared up at the next stop, but the after smell still hung on, and Tucky's face was still a pale shade of green. He looked dreadful, and David tried to ignore him and to concentrate on the line of the hills in the distance. He thought it looked like the pictures of Devon he'd seen at school, but they were still hours away from Exeter, and as the journey dragged on, his thoughts returned again to his house in Islington. Tucky was feeling better. "My mum said it won't be long," he said suddenly. David said nothing. "She said the war would be over in a few months and we'd all be home again, so it won't be long, will it?" "Depends on who wins it," David said. "We'll win it," Paul Browning said from the other side of the carriage. "Everyone says we'll win." "Then it'll be a long war." "Who says?" Paul said, sneering. "That's what my dad said," David replied quietly. He hated mentioning his father, and he hadn't meant to. He felt vulnerable now. "He said that if the Germans win, it'll be a short war, and if we win, it'll be long." "But we won last time," Tucky piped up. "We won then, didn't we?" "Yeah, he's right." Paul was leaning forward. "We won all right, and what you can do once, you can do again. That's right, isn't it, miss?" "What is, Paul?" Miss Roberts looked up. "The war, miss. Davy says we won't win it. You heard him, miss. We beat them last time, so we will again. Stands to reason, doesn't it, miss?" Miss Roberts closed her book. "No, Paul, it doesn't stand to reason." She sounded firm, and everyone listened when she sounded firm. "I think we shall win in the end. I certainly hope we do. But it will not be in a few weeks or a few months. It may take a long time to win, a year, 2 or 3, who knows? You must understand that you will not be going home for some time now. You'll have a new home and a new school, and it won't be easy for you, but it will be a lot easier if you can understand that you won't be going home for a long time. One day we'll all go back to Islington, but not for a long time. Understand?" It could not have been clearer. David had won his duel with Paul, but it gave him no pleasure. He would gladly have lost One little argument for some ray of hope from Miss Roberts. There was none. The carriage fell silent and remained that way until the train pulled into Exeter station. It was dark already and they were hungry. Placards were put on, cases checked. Then they were on the platform and out into the cold. Tucky and David stuck together while Miss Roberts gathered the whole school around her for a roll call. Then she led the way through the ticket barrier and towards a waiting bus. There were people everywhere, but it was not like the bustle and noise at Paddington. Here they were standing and staring solemnly as the boys straggled through the ticket hall. "Where are you boys from, my dear?" The ticket collector put his hand on David's shoulder and turned him round. "London," said David. "I know that, my dear," he said easily. "I know that right enough, but whereabouts in London?" David felt foolish and flushed. "Islington," said Tucky. "Not heard of that, have you?" he asked around him, and everyone shook their heads. David felt foolish and flushed. "Islington," said Tucky. "Not heard of that, have you?" he asked around him, and everyone shook their head. "Off you go then, my dear, and keep smiling." David did not know what he should be smiling about, and he could not help wondering how anyone could have reached the age of an ancient ticket collector without ever having heard of Islington. "Talk funny, don't they?" said Tucky as he rushed after the others. Miss Roberts marshalled them into the dark green coach in the station yard, and David sat with Tucky on the long bench seat at the back and waited. They all waited, but nothing happened. Then someone realised the driver was missing, and a policeman went off in the dark to look for him. The boys sat numbed in their seats, every one of them exhausted, too exhausted even to be homesick. The driver came back eventually, and there were angry words in front of the bus. Miss Evers was giving him a piece of her mind. The blackout was in force, and the headlights of the bus were hooded so that only a thin slit of light struck the road ahead. The engine throbbed underneath them, and the bus moved at last. The journey through the dark lanes seemed unending. David sensed that they must be out in the countryside because there were no houses. All he could see were high hedges and the occasional glimpse of a field as the headlights skimmed over it and through a gateway. No one spoke in the bus. It was too noisy, but no one felt like it anyway. Tucky had gone to sleep on David's shoulder, but kept waking up every few minutes to ask if they were there. Halfway down the coach, David could make out the shape of Miss Roberts's hat, as it was lit up from time to time by the glow of her cigarette. "This is it!" the driver's voice shouted, and the coach slowed down. Tucky woke up with a start. "Round this bend and you're here." "Placards and cases," said Miss Roberts. "Don't leave anything behind." "And don't forget your cases, children," Miss Hardy echoed. "Make sure it's your own case and no one else's. Check them now, children." The bus had stopped, but David could see nothing out of the windows. He rubbed an island clear of steam and peered through. They were in a small square surrounded by low buildings. A door was thrown open in the darkness, and a shaft of yellow light flooded out towards the coach. "Everyone out!" Miss Roberts walked sideways down the centre of the coach. "And mind your manners now." The lights of the village hall were blinding at first, and David blinked and squinted his way down the hall. There were faces all around him, peering red faces and eyes that followed him. He looked away and followed on up some wooden steps and onto a platform. There were 2 long benches, and David found himself in the back row, and Tucky slid in next to him. It was warm in the hall, and from somewhere came the smell of tomato soup, red tomato soup. It was thick and not too hot, and they were each given a great hunk of brown bread with which they dumped into the white enamel cups. David ate his slowly, savouring the warmth. Every new mouthful sent comforting shivers down his body. He had hoped for some of Tucky's, but clearly Tucky was feeling well enough now to finish his. Then there were cheese rolls, and they washed it all down with the sweetest cocoa David had ever tasted. The cocoa was too much for Tucky, and he emptied his into David's mug, and David crouched over it, warming his hands. Down in the hall, everyone had stopped talking, and Miss Roberts was speaking. "The boys have all had a very long day, and I think we should get them off to bed as quickly as we can, but I know they'd like me to thank you kind people for a welcoming meal. It's a long time since we've eaten like that. Now most of you are having one boy to stay, and some 2 or 3. Do choose quickly. They're a good bunch of boys, and I know you'll look after them as well as you can. You'll find their names and ages on their placards, so as soon as you've chosen the one you're having, please register with Miss Evers at the table by the door. That way we'll know where everyone has gone to. It wouldn't do to lose anyone now, would it? Take the first row first, and then the back row will move forward. The crowd of faces in the hall moved in closer, looking up at them. The children sat sipping their cocoa and gazed back down at them. There was a lot of whispering, and it was a long time before anyone moved. Then one of the ladies stepped forward and peered closely for a moment at Paul's placard. She smiled up at him over her glasses. "Come on then, Paul," she said, tapping him on the knee. "Let's get the ball rolling. You come along with me." "Yes, miss," said Paul, and looked to Miss Roberts for reassurance. Miss Roberts nodded. "Off you go then, Paul, and be good now." Miss Roberts spoke kindly, and Paul got up and walked down the steps into the hall. The lady took his case, and the 2 of them walked away towards Miss Evers' table at the back of the hall. "Doesn't know what she's in for," Tucky whispered from behind his cocoa mug, and David smiled for the first time that day. He sipped his cocoa and looked around the hall, trying to pick out a face he liked, but there were too many people, and they were too remote to be real. It was a smooth enough business after that. One by one the chairs on the platform emptied, and soon the whole front row was gone. Miss Roberts beckoned the back row into their places. Sam went, Billy Preston and Graham Watts went together, and gradually the hall was emptying. There was a small knot by the registration table, and Miss Roberts was with them. There was something wrong. David could tell that. Everyone kept glancing back up at the platform where David and Tucky sat side by side at the end of the front row. There was no one left. "I'm sorry, Miss Roberts," said one of the ladies. "I'm sorry, but there's been an upset." "They've got to sleep somewhere, don't they?" Miss Roberts sounded crisp. They were speaking in that urgent half-whisper that adults use when they don't want to alarm listening children. "'Tis Mr. Reynolds out on Hamley Farm. He's not coming to collect. They were all told 8:30. He was told, like the rest. 'Tis past 11 now. Can't think where he's to." "But even with Mr. Reynolds, that still leaves one boy unaccounted for," Miss Roberts insisted. "That'll be all right. You'll see, my dear. We'll find him somewhere. Poor little scrap." Tucky leaned closer to David. "Davy, if they can't find anyone to look after us, will they send us home, do you think?" "Doubt it." "But what will they do with us then?" "Miss Roberts will see us right," David said hopefully. "Don't worry, she'll see to it." "Davy, why do you think no one chose us?" Tucky droned on in his flat voice. "And they didn't choose me because you were sitting next to me, and they didn't choose you because I was sitting next to you. And besides, we're not the prettiest in the class, are we?" He tried to joke it away, but he was hurt inside just as Tucky was. Time and time again people had looked him over and passed him by. "Anyway," he went on, "I don't much like the look of them." "Nor me," said Tucky. "Nor me." The arguing at the end of the hall had dwindled to an inaudible whisper now, as they all realised the 2 boys might overhear them. But the longer it went on, the more obvious it became that the situation was serious. No one else seems to have room for an evacuee, and it looked very much as if Mr. Reynolds might not be coming at all. Finally, Miss Roberts suggested that they should give the boys a bed in the hall for the night, and someone went off to look for mattresses and blankets. Miss Hardy looked as if she would burst into tears at any minute, and Miss Evers kept throwing up her hands in disgust. Meanwhile, David and Tucky sat alone upon the platform, too tired and bewildered even to care what happened to them.